Her grandmother called it the nursing ground, not in any scientific sense, not with any particular awareness that what she was naming had a name in other languages, in other traditions, in the literature of estuarine ecology that neither she nor anyone in her family had ever read. She called it the nursing ground because that was what she saw it do every spring. The juvenile fish coming in, concentrating in that section of the estuary in numbers that didn't make sense given the surrounding habitat, staying for weeks, and then moving out to deeper water, larger and ready for whatever came next. Addie Mae Washington was 66 years old. She was the last person from her family's fishing community still working this creek. Not the last person alive. There were cousins scattered up and down the South Carolina coast, aunts and uncles in Charleston and Beaufort. Children of the original families who had fished this water for generations and had moved away under the accumulated pressure of rising property taxes and declining fish prices and the steady erosion of the economic logic of small boat coastal fishing. Some of them still came back for holidays. None of them worked the water anymore. Her grandmother had worked it for 60 years. Her great-grandmother before her, the community that had once sustained 20 families on this tidal creek, had contracted, season by season and generation by generation, not from any single cause, but from the accumulated weight of property tax increases that made holding waterfront land more expensive every year, from declining fish prices that made the work less viable every decade, from the particular arithmetical way of life that required everything to work in alignment and found fewer and fewer things in alignment as the years passed, until it was just Addie Mae, maintaining her family's small dock and setting her crab traps and working the oyster beds in the way she'd been taught, the way her grandmother had been taught, the way the families who had come here after emancipation had taught each other what the water could provide if you were patient enough to learn its habits. She had fragments of what her grandmother knew, not the full knowledge. Her grandmother had died before Addie Mae was old enough to receive it completely, before the transfer was finished. She had what a teenager absorbed from watching, from being corrected when she did something wrong, from the stories that old women told at the dock in the early mornings when the work was slow. She had the nursing ground's name and location, and the basic fact of what happened there. She did not have the why. The nursing ground was a section of the estuary's inner margin, where the creek turned toward the marsh and the water became very shallow for about 40 yards, barely knee-deep at mid-tide. It sat in a particular orientation that Addie Mae had never analyzed in geometric terms. She simply knew that the light hit it differently in the mornings than it hit the adjacent marsh sections, and at the bottom there had a specific texture that she had felt with her feet 1,000 times, a mix of mud and fine shell that was different from the harder substrate on either side. Every March, the juvenile fish came. Mullet fingerlings, juvenile spot, young croaker, species that would later move to the deeper channels and eventually to the offshore waters. They came into this section of the inner estuary in concentrations that were visible from the dock if the light was right, a disturbance on the surface when they were dense, a quality of animation in the water that she had learned to read the way her grandmother had taught her to read it. Her grandmother had said, when the water moves like that in March, the nursing ground is working. Stay out of it until they go. Addie Mae had always stayed out of it. She had built her seasonal fishing schedule around it. She had never once set gear in that section during the juvenile weeks because her grandmother had told her not to, and because 40 years of watching had confirmed that her grandmother had been right about why. She had watched this every March for 40 years. She had never tried to explain why it happened because she had never needed to explain it. The knowledge that it happened and where it happened was sufficient for the practical purposes of someone who fished this creek. You didn't set gear near the nursing ground in March. You didn't disturb the bottom there during the juvenile season. You left it alone the way her grandmother had left alone and her grandmother's grandmother before that. It had been protected by the practice of leaving it alone. The practice had survived as long as the community had been here to practice it. Now the community was gone, and Addie Mae was the last practitioner, and she had been watching the nursing ground do its work for 40 years without anyone to hand it to. The Marina development proposal had been moving through the county planning process for 2 years before Addie Mae read the site plans carefully enough to understand what the fill footprint included. She had known about the development in general terms. A luxury marina and resort complex on the creek's western margin, the kind of project the Lowcountry had been absorbing for decades, the conversion of working waterfront to recreational waterfront, which was a story she had watched play out all along this coast since she was a young woman. She had attended the early planning meetings with the attention of someone who knew the process well enough to know when her voice would matter and when it wouldn't, and she had said what she could say about the creek's ecology in the terms she had available to her. The fill footprint was larger than she had understood from the renderings. When the site plans were released in detail, she sat with them at her kitchen table and traced the filled area with her finger: east boundary, north boundary, the waterline, the inner margin where the creek bent toward the marsh. Her finger stopped. The nursing ground was inside the fill footprint, not near it, inside it. The fill line ran directly through the section where the juveniles came every March, covering it completely. She sat at the table for a while, without moving. Then she drove to the creek and stood at the edge of the section for a long time. The ground was the same ground she had been looking at for 40 years. In 6 months it would be filled. She stood at the edge of the nursing ground and tried to understand what it meant to be the last person who knew what this place was in the years before it stopped being this place. She raised it at the Development Authority's public hearing. She stood at the comment microphone and said what she knew, that this section of the inner estuary margin had served as juvenile fish habitat for as long as her family had been working this creek, which was more than 100 years, and that her grandmother had called it the nursing ground because of what it did in spring, and that she had watched it do that thing every March for 40 years. She said, "I don't know the mechanism. I can tell you what happens there. I've been watching it my whole life. I can't tell you the exact biology because that knowledge went with my grandmother and her grandmother before her, and the community that understood this creek has mostly moved on. What I have is the name and the location, and 40 years of my own observation. And I'm telling you that what happens in that section of the creek every March matters to what happens in the rest of this creek in every season after." The Development Authority's marine biologist, a careful man named Dr. Hollis, listened respectfully. He said the area had been assessed as part of the Estuary Impact Review. He said the inner margin section Addie Mae was describing had been classified as secondary marsh habitat, ecologically significant in the aggregate, but functionally equivalent to the adjacent sections. He said the environmental mitigation plan included compensatory marsh creation at a replacement site 3 miles up the coast. Addie Mae said, "The fish don't go to replacement sites. They come to that specific place." Dr. Hollis said that the species she was describing were generalist habitat users at the juvenile stage and would use available alternative habitat as conditions allowed. She thanked him and sat down. She was not surprised. She had not expected to win the argument. She had not known, when she stood up, what it would feel like to describe something in fragments, to have the name and the location and 40 years of watching, and to lack the understanding that would have let her say, "Here is why." The full knowledge had belonged to people who were gone. What survived in her was sufficient to know the nursing ground existed and mattered. It was not sufficient to explain it in a way that a professional environmental review could incorporate. She had never felt, before that hearing, the specific weight of what her grandmother hadn't had time to finish telling her. Her grandmother had given her the name and the practice and 40 years of shared observation before she died. She had not given her the mechanism, not because she had withheld it, but because the mechanism had been community knowledge, distributed across everyone who had ever worked this creek together, not something any single person had held alone. You didn't need to understand the why if you were surrounded by people who collectively understood it. You only discovered the gap when you were the last one left. The fill proceeded on schedule. She watched it from her dock across the creek. The barges, the equipment, the methodical conversion of the inner marsh margin into engineered fill and armor. The nursing ground disappeared over 3 weeks in late summer, covered by material that would eventually support a dock extension and a waterfront promenade. In March of the following year, Addie Mae stood at the dock at first light and looked at where the nursing ground had been. She stood there for an hour. The fish did not come, not to the filled section. That was not surprising. It was now fill and concrete and the beginning of a dock structure. But they did not concentrate in the adjacent sections either, the way she might have hoped if Dr. Hollis had been right about generalist habitat users finding alternative sites. The replacement marsh 3 miles up the coast was there. She had driven to look at it the previous week. She did not know if the fish were using it. She knew they were not here, where they had always been. They simply were not there, or were present in numbers so reduced from what she had watched for 40 years that she could not detect them from the dock. She stood there for an hour. She noted it in the crab trap log she kept. Not systematically, not in scientific terms, but in the practical notation of a working fisherman. March, nursing ground gone. Juvenile fish absent from inner margin. First time in memory. She did not submit a formal comment. She did not know where to send it or what it would accomplish. She went back to her work. The fisheries researcher who found her was a woman named Dr. Kamal, who had been monitoring juvenile fish recruitment patterns in the South Carolina Lowcountry estuaries for 4 years and had noticed, in her regional dataset, an anomaly in this creek's juvenile cohort the year after the Marina fill. Recruitment to adult size was down in the 3rd year following fill, not catastrophically, but measurably, in a way that stood out against a regional baseline. She had read Addie Mae's public hearing comment in the Development Authority's record. She came to the dock on a Tuesday morning in November. Addie Mae showed her the creek. She showed her where the nursing ground had been. She could still point to location precisely, even though what was there now was fill and armor and the beginning of a dock structure. She described what happened every March. She said what her grandmother had called it and why. Dr. Kamal asked questions for 2 hours. She asked about the substrate, the watercolor in March, the tide stage when the concentrations were highest, the species mix, whether the pattern varied with rainfall or temperature, what adjacent sections looked like compared to the nursing ground during the same weeks. She asked questions that required Addie Mae to search her memory more carefully than she had searched it in years, and Addie Mae found things she hadn't known she still had, details from 40 years of observation that she hadn't tried to articulate before because there had been no one to articulate them to. At the end, she asked Addie Mae how far back the community's knowledge of this site went. Addie Mae said, "My great-grandmother was fishing this creek after emancipation. She taught my grandmother, who taught my mother, who taught me what she could before she died." The name goes back at least that far. The practice of leaving it alone goes back at least that far. Dr. Kamal was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The feature your grandmother named is what we call a thermal refuge. There's a specific combination of factors in that section I can see from the creek's orientation and the substrate description that would have a particular morning thermal signature from solar heating, combined with what sounds like a freshwater seep underneath that cold freshen the bottom at certain tide stages. That combination makes a temperature microhabitat, a place where juvenile fish can regulate their body temperature more effectively during the early spring transition. It's a nursery function, highly site-specific, not replicable by generalized marsh creation at a different location." She said, "The reason your grandmother called it the nursing ground is because it was..." Addie Mae looked at the fill where the nursing ground had been. She thought about her grandmother standing at the same dock, watching the juvenile fish come in every March, knowing what it meant without knowing why it worked that way, and giving it the name that carried a function, so that the next person who stood here would know not to disturb it, without understanding why they were leaving it alone. The full knowledge had lived in the community. The community had dispersed. What had survived was the name and the location, and the practice, passed in fragments through whatever generations happened to be paying attention, until it reached Addie Mae as something she knew, but could not fully explain. That was what had survived. That was all that had survived. And it had been enough, not to stop the fill, which was already done, but enough for Dr. Kamal to understand what had been lost, and to document in a way that might protect somewhere else, someday, before someone else's grandmother's name for a place had to do all the work of explanation alone. Dr. Kamal's findings were published in a regional journal on estuarine ecology. The paper described the thermal refuge characteristics of the filled site, the juvenile fish recruitment anomaly that followed the fill, and the mechanism that had made the site function as a nursery habitat. It also included, in its historical documentation section, a description of the Gullah Geechee fishing community's traditional ecological knowledge of the site, the nursing ground name, the practice of leaving it undisturbed during the juvenile season, and the generational chain through which that knowledge had been carried for more than a century. The paper noted that the only surviving record of the site's traditional use was a single community member who had received the knowledge in fragments, The name, the location, the observation, but not the full biological explanation, and that this incomplete transmission was itself a consequence of the community's dispersal, which had ended the generational continuity through which such knowledge was normally passed. The paper recommended that the county's environmental review process for estuarine development projects in lowcountry communities consider soliciting traditional ecological knowledge from Gullah Geechee fishing community members as part of standard impact assessment, specifically noting that such knowledge could identify site-specific habitat functions not captured in standard survey methodologies. Addie Mae read the paper at her kitchen table one evening. The creek visible through the window, the fill and the dock structure visible on the far side. She thought about her grandmother at the dock in the early morning, describing what she saw in March. She thought about all the mornings in 40 years when she stood at this dock and watched the juvenile fish concentrate in the nursing ground, knowing that something important was happening and not knowing in technical terms why. She thought about the word the paper used, incomplete transmission. 2 words for 100 years of people trying to give each other the things they knew before the knowing was lost. She thought, my grandmother gave me everything she had time to give. She gave me the name and the place and the practice. What she didn't give me, the biological mechanism, the why, wasn't something she failed to give. It was something the community had understood collectively, in a way that lived in everyone who worked this creek together, shared across 20 families across multiple generations, and that couldn't survive in one person alone. The knowledge hadn't been incomplete. The community had been incomplete. The dispersal had done what dispersal always did. Left behind a partial record in the last person standing, which was not the same as the full knowledge that had once lived in everyone together. 2 words for that, incomplete transmission, as if the knowledge had been a message that almost arrived. Addie Mae closed the paper. She looked at the creek. The creek was still there. The fill was there. The dock structure was there. In March, whatever juveniles used this creek now would find something different than what had been here before, and they would use it or not use it according to what it offered, without any knowledge of what had been here before. The creek would adapt. It always had. But it would adapt to something lesser, because something specific had been here and was now gone, and the only people who had known exactly what was were mostly gone too, and what remained was a name and 40 years of one woman's watching and a grief that did not have a form that fit anywhere in the Development Authority's records. She went back to her work then. She kept fishing this creek the way she always had, the way her grandmother had fished it, because that was the right thing to do and because she was the last person who would. She did not know what would happen to the dock after she was gone. She did not know if anyone would come back to work this water. She did not know of the knowledge that had survived in her, the fragments, the name, the location, the 40 years of watching, would survive her or end with her the way her grandmother's full understanding had ended with the community's dispersal. She went to the dock most mornings out of habit and love and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had been doing something her whole life and had not yet been given a reason sufficient to stop. The creek was still there. The nursing ground was not. But the creek was still there, and it was still doing what creeks did, and she was still watching it, and that was not nothing.